Now, an estimated 8,000 women in India were killed in 2013 because their families could not afford more money or goods to form a dowry. Now, while India outlawed the dowry in 1961, this month the country's Supreme Court ruled that anti-dowry laws are used unfairly by women to prosecute their husbands. The court ruled that, quote, anti-dowry statutes are used as weapons rather than shields. The simplest way to harass is to get the husband and his relatives arrested under this provision. Well, joining me now to discuss is Rama Lakshmi, staff writer with the Washington Post India Bureau and the author of this piece, India High Court's Disgruntled Wives, Ruling Test Dowry Laws Enacted to Protect Women. So thanks so much for being with us, Rama. I want to start by just asking you, obviously the dowry was outlawed in the 1960s, as you mentioned in your piece, and India has made significant gains in terms of women's rights over the past few decades. So why back out now?
I wouldn't say it's a backing out. Yes, Indian women have made significant gains in the women's movement, and this law itself has been hugely useful for women who face cruelty, domestic abuse, and constant harassment by their husbands and their families in many cases. But over the years, at least in the last 10 years or so, there has been simmering discontent. A lot of people are looking at it saying this is being misused. A lot of breakdown of marriage for other reasons. The women since divorce is still stigmatized in India, a lot of the women end up using this law because it was, until now, it's the most strong law for women.
So what's the reaction being?
That are effectively implemented. So a lot of them just use this law to. A lot of them do use this law to just teach their in-laws a lesson and things like that.
So Rama, what's the reaction been from Indian women as a result of this latest legislation?
The women's groups are looking at it and saying the tone of this ruling is going to hurt the women's movement and the gains that Indian women have made in the last few decades. Some of them do privately admit that there is misuse, and they say, look, every law in India is misused, around the world is misused, why just single out the anti-dowry law? But they say the tone of the ruling, which calls them disgruntled wives who are just throwing their husbands and their in-laws into prison, and it's being used as a weapon. So they say this goes into victim blaming. This is going to discourage women. The language is going to discourage women from coming out and reporting, is what many of the women's groups that I interviewed said.
Right.
And but there is this huge support group that has been formed over the years across India that meets, at least the ones in Delhi, they meet every week in the court lawns, and they're all people who say we've been wrongly accused of dowry demands and harassment.
So, Rama, I've got a comment here from one of our HuffPost Live community members. This is from Tirana, who says, dowries are completely unjustified. It leaves women helpless and her family in economic ruins. Why do women have to pay someone to marry them? Maybe give us a little bit of context. how often are marriages actually arranged in India today? And what is the dowry and the arrangement of the dowry based on? Well,
I tend to agree with the comment. It is something that's anachronistic. This is 21st century. This should have been done away with a long time ago. But even though it was outlawed in 61, because Indian marriages, most Indian marriages, more than 95, I would say, but a lot of people would say 98%, are arranged by parents. They're not where a boy and a girl or a man and a woman fall in love and get married. They're arranged by parents, and social status, caste system, all these things play a role. And there is a premium on a groom. And if the groom has higher studies, is in a really good job, and he comes with a bigger dowry price. It has, over the years, at least in the big cities, among the upwardly mobile middle class, it has become more subtle in the sense that they don't give you a list that they used to do that 2 decades ago. They would hand over a list saying, okay, we'll say okay to the marriage if you give us the list, and the list will have all the things. It's become more subtle now. A lot of them say we don't want anything, but just make sure that our status, social status, is kept in mind. So, what the women's parents spend on the marriage, what they give in terms of gifts to the daughter. Now, the gifts to the daughter doesn't go to the husband; it stays with the gift. Like, for instance, the jewelry. If a woman goes to the police and says my in-laws are harassing me, the police will ensure that the jewelry, the gold jewelry, goes back to the woman. That's a woman's wealth, so that doesn't go to the in-laws. But then, in many marriages, they will say, I need a car, I need a motorcycle, I need some money to set up my son in some business, open a shop. So there are these constant demands, and if not demands, then there are taunts saying, what did your father give? He sent you empty-handed. So this also leads to the whole gamut of harassment under dowry, so even a taunt.
Right, so Rama, just on from that, the idea of the harassment, you already kind of alluded a bit to domestic violence, but in your piece, you say, quote, over the years, the number of brides who were killed by their husbands and families grew because brides' parents could not feed the continuing demands of their husbands' families. Even after the wedding, many of these deaths were reported as suicides or euphemistically documented as kitchen accidents. So, be a little bit more explicit for us. What are kitchen accidents, and just how prevalent is the, problem of domestic abuse for women in India at the moment, and where does the country stand when it comes to women's rights?
Kitchen accidents. Now, those were that was the language that was used in the 70s and 80s. They were not recording them as dowry deaths. What would happen was, when I was growing up in India in the 80s, one heard many cases where the woman was burned to death. She poured kerosene over her, kerosene, the cooking oil, not cooking oil, cooking fuel. So she would pour it over her head, and the reporting would be that it was a suicide or it was a kitchen accident because she was working in the kitchen and then, somehow the kerosene fell on her or something like that. But there were so many that it just became really difficult to even process that how many kitchen accidents could there be. That's why, the whole dowry death issue was taken up in the 80s, and really strong laws were brought in, one in 83, one in 86. But it has got, what was your second question?
It was more about just the general state of human rights and women's rights in India at the moment. But unfortunately, Ram, we have to leave it there. We don't have enough time to kind of go into that, but we'll certainly be following up with a larger segment about this as we've done before on HuffPost Live. But I want to thank you so much for joining us today and offering that analysis.
Thank you.